Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Game Technicon video we're going to be discussing and analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up over the past 24 or so hours. We're going to be starting things out with Intel, specifically news on a 28-core, 56-thread top-end SKU on the X599 platform. And this will be using the LGA 3647 socket. Of course, during Computex 2018, we did see Intel demo a 28-core, 56-thread processor running at the now fabled 5 GHz, but of course later on we figured out that the processor was not exactly a genuine scenario that you would probably see on your desktop. In other words, they were using specialized cooling, but even so, it did serve as a prototype. Now, according to the latest leaks and rumors, we will actually be seeing this processor emerging onto shelves, and it will be aimed at the same niche as the 2990WX processor from AMD. There's not a super amount of information at the moment on the platform, but from the leaks from HD Technologica, they claim that we will be looking at 6 memory channels, so that means we have 12 sticks of memory. Of course, this does mean that, at least in theory, Intel will have the memory bandwidth advantage compared to the Threadripper 2 series, and obviously pricing will be fairly high as well. We're probably going to be looking at way north of $2,000 US. It remains to be seen what type of performance we're going to be getting out of these chips, but even so, they will once again be based on the Skylake X architecture, so we probably know roughly architecturally what we're going to be seeing. I'm most curious though on how these chips perform, and of course other SKUs as well. Intel have obviously been losing out in terms of the value / price situation with AMD recently. So it does make sense for the company to release SKUs of the lower core counts at competitive pricing, but we can only wait and see in that area. And now, on to the main topic of today's video, and that is Nvidia's Siggraph conference. We're going to be doing a full analysis of what we know thus far of the Turing architecture along with the Quadro series, and we can also make some good guesses of what we're going to be seeing as well for the RTX 2080. And also we've seen some benchmarks pop up as well for games. So obviously this means that we're going to be talking about this for quite a while, but it's worth noting that Nvidia themselves do say that this has been the most important advancement in GPUs from their company for about 10 years now. This coincides to when we saw Nvidia launch the 8800 GTX series. So if you don't know, before that, we had fixed function hardware, so you had vertex shaders and pixel shaders and blah 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 blah. The point was that it was the best that they had at the time. But obviously workloads can change on a whim. So not only can they change on a per frame basis, but goodness knows what one game developer is going to assume that the graphics card's going to have compared to a different developer, and then you've got different game engines. In a nutshell, it was very hard to fully utilize and to assume what hardware to put into a graphics card, so companies decided to go with a unified architecture. This meant that the shaders on the GPU could all do different things based upon what the developers wanted. They could program that, and that also came out with a new shading model, which of course coincided with the release of DirectX 10. Okay, so you're with me so far. But of course, this also led to other important things. It meant that in Nvidia's case, CUDA became a thing where you could run other things on the GPU. So for example, you could run AI and physics, or you could do, I don't know, little things that haven't really taken off too much, like deep learning. That hasn't really gone too much, has it? No one really cares about deep learning in the industry. Anyway, all of those different things have been critical and have really revolutionized computing. But according to Nvidia, there has been another major breakthrough, and that is ray tracing. And here we are with Turing. Now, if I had to give an elevator pitch for the Turing architecture, I could summarize it thusly. Turing is Volta, but just improved in every way. Now, this is also an article, and you can find that linked in the video description if you so desire. I will say that currently we don't have all of the information, and I'm sure that this will change over the next coming weeks, especially when the the RTX 2080 and other cards are announced formally, which will happen in around a week. But let's go through the information that we do know thus far. So there are 3 Quadro model RTX cards. There's the 8000, the 6000, and finally the 5000. They do have differences, of course, as you would expect. The 8000 card features 4608 CUDA cores, while the RTX 5000 series features just 3072 CUDA cores. We also have differences in the number of tensor cores as well, with 384 being the number we're seeing for the 5000 series and 576 tensor cores for the RTX 8000 series of Quadro cards. Just from what we know about Nvidia's past on how they've handled Quadro versus the Geforce lineup, we can most likely assume that the RTX 5000 card is going to be the card that the GTX 2080 is based upon. There are some questions, however, regarding how it's going to handle ray tracing and the tensor core units, but we'll go into that later on in the video as we continue to discuss the specifications of the GPU. So, one of the critical ways that Nvidia have changed the architecture of Turing is by adding RT cores. Unfortunately, we don't have all of the details yet on how these GPUs work, but these processor blocks will allow the acceleration of both ray triangle intersection checks and bounding volume hierarchy, also known as BVH. So what this basically does is it enables the GPU to calculate where a ray will actually land. In other words, does it hit a piece of geometry, does it hit a primitive, or does it hit nothing? Now, up until recently, up until we have actually had Turing, this has just not been possible in real time. And according to Jensen Huang, who obviously knows a thing or two about this, he claims that it's the reason it's taken so long. They've been just working on actually putting together the units that have, which will allow this to be possible. This will actually work in conjunction with the tensor cores. So the tensor cores will run AI routines, and what they will do is enable a lower resolution of image to be created using ray tracing, and then what that allows is for the AI to then reconstruct and denoise that image for us to display on screen. The fastest Turing part, which once again is the Quadro 8000, can run up to 10 billion, that's 10 gigaраys per second. Now, compare this to Pascal, we're looking at a 25 times speed up, which is absolutely mental. And that is, once again, the reason that this is possible to run in real time. We're looking at 25 times speed up. However, the Quadro 5000, the RTX 5000, is capable of just 6 billion. So that's still pretty darn fast and still massively outperforms anything that was capable, anything that Pascal was capable of. We also see tensor cores allowing 125 T-flops of FP16 performance, 25 tops of integer 8 performance, and 500 tops of integer 4 performance. Obviously, this does depend upon the level of precision that developers require. For those wondering what number of tensor cores we're going to be seeing with the RTX 2080, that is still unknown. So, unfortunately, we're going to have to wait a week or so, most likely, for Nvidia to release that information. So, the Turing SM streaming multiprocessor is very similar to the Volta streaming multiprocessor. It allows 16 T-flops and 16 TIPS. Now, this means that you can have concurrent FP16 and concurrent integer operations running simultaneously. The benefit of this is pretty darn obvious. It means that, essentially speaking, the GPU can just run a lot more operations simultaneously. How this is going to translate to games remains to be seen, but at least in theory, it means we could have drastically improved performance in certain applications. We also see unified level 1 cache. Now, this was something that was present in Volta to a degree, but we don't quite know how it measures up with the compared to Volta, because with Volta it was basically merged into shared memory. So we don't know if this is like an extension of that, exactly the same, or just operates slightly differently. We also don't know whether this GPU will support fast FP16, rapid packed math, and those type of operations. It's almost certain it does, based upon Nvidia's history and current architectures, but it's just not been confirmed yet by the company. The fact that we have concurrent FP16 along with integer operations, though, is a a byproduct of the fact that we actually have separate units now on the GPU, which is obviously a rather large improvement compared to Pascal. By far the most obvious announcement was the inclusion of GDDR6 memory. Come on, no one was surprised that we have GDDR6 on Turing. Without any question, it was probably the worst kept secret of this GPU. And, well, it's not surprising. We have 14 GBps memory, and it is produced by Samsung at 2 GB capacity. So what does that mean? Well, the Quadro 5000, the RTX 5000, has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, whereas the top dog, the 8000, has 48 gigabytes of VRAM. Now that means that we have memory buses between 256-bit all the way up to 384-bit. So in terms of memory bandwidth, then the 8000 has 672 gigabytes per second memory bandwidth, while the 5000 has 448 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. So to put that into some level of context, you've got the RTX 5000, which once again has 448 gigabytes per second, and the GTX 1080, which has 352 gigabytes per second. We also see support for NVLink. Nvidia are touting 100 gigabytes per second of bandwidth using NVLink, although exactly how scalable this is with multiple GPUs hasn't quite been confirmed yet. Now, if you listen to Jensen Huang, he's saying that this essentially means you have unified frame buffers between the two GPUs because the memory bandwidth is so high. But even if you take, let's say, the 600 plus gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth, or even the 448 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth of the RTX 5000 series, then obviously there is quite a deficit there. So it's not quite as good, but possibly with really good SDKs and optimizations, it might help some. What this does mean, though, is that the 8000, for all intents and purposes, if you believe Nvidia's marketing, and once again we're going to have to wait for independent benchmarks to verify this, you can essentially address up to 96 gigabytes of memory. That's quite a lot of RAM on a GPU. A little more information then regarding the actual Turing GPU itself. We're looking at 18.6 billion transistors and 754 mm². Now that is pretty darn gargantuan. It is absolutely gargantuan. In fact, it's second only to Volta, the GV100, which has a die size of 815 mm² and 21.1 billion transistors. So yes, it is a little bit smaller, but not that much smaller. From what we understand, it's not on 7nm either. It is still using the TSMC Nvidia 12nm process. Once again, just for a second, focusing on the RTX 8000, 4608 CUDA cores, 576 tensor cores. ROPs haven't been confirmed, but most likely we're looking at 96. But what about the clock speed? Well, it's not been 100% confirmed what types of base and boost clocks we're going to be looking at across the line, but it's looking at around 1730, 1750 is probably going to be what we're going to be seeing for the RTX Quadro cards, at least the 8000. We can therefore presume a figure around 1800 to 1700 is probably going to be roughly what we're going to be seeing for the next generation of Geforce cards. Although just focusing on Geforce just for a second though, one of the earlier rumours of Geforce was that it's going to be better at clock management. We're going to see, well, basically just more aggressive clocks. What does that mean? Is it going to just be better at fine-grained control over the clocks? Is it going to just be that the GPU is better at that power gating? So, for example, if a set of ROPs isn't being used, or let's say a set of cache isn't being used, or a set of CUDA cores, you get the idea. It's just going to power down those more efficiently, and therefore you're going to get lower voltages, lower power consumption, lower heat output. Is it just going to enable it to boost higher anyway? We just don't know yet. It does appear that the reference blower design is back for this GPU. In fact, you can see that the shroud and the cooler itself looks almost identical to what we've seen previously. I'm basing this, of course, purely on the Quadro series that Jensen Huang and Nvidia have shown off thus far. Obviously, that doesn't mean a damn thing to the actual Geforce lineup. For all we know, the Geforce lineup could be cooled by a turnip on top of it. But still, most likely we can say that yes, the two things are going to be very similar. That means A, that the dual fan design is gone, and B, there's not going to be anything special here. You don't need a nuclear reactor to power it, and there's also not going to be the dual fan design that had been rumoured previously. There is going to be a lot more information, obviously, over the next several days as Siggraph finishes, as a lot more slides become available, and of course when Geforce itself is announced. And when that becomes available, when that information comes to light, and of course the card's launch, we'll certainly have a lot more information on you, reviews, and all of the other bits and pieces you'd expect. But now let's finish off with some of the features of the RTX series, and then we're going to go into the GTX 2080 stuff, specifically some benchmarks and other bits and pieces that have leaked. So one major change here is we have USB-C virtual link as well. That makes sense. It means that there's going to be a fifth type of display port now added on to the GPU. Once again, this was quite an early rumor / it just made sense given we've seen some GTX 1080s and even some Tis, I think, that have had this. There are currently, at least to my knowledge, no headsets on the market which actually have made use of this, and I don't know if there's any presently ready to be released. But given all of the major players, including Nvidia and Oculus and so on, are all behind this, it just makes sense that Nvidia incorporate this onto their GPU. This is particularly true when it just makes life a lot easier. A single cable carries the power, it carries the data, it carries the video signal. It just makes using a VR display a lot smoother. It makes it less of a pain in the butt. We also have DisplayPort 1.4, support up to 8K resolution, and all the other bits and pieces, which just basically screams next generation performance out of this damn thing. Perhaps one of the more impressive demos was the Star Wars demo, which Jensen Huang was very quick to point out multiple times that it was being handled in real time with just a single Quadro card. He didn't specifically mention the model, at least as far as I can remember, but let's be honest, it's probably the RTX 8000. Even so, I'm bloody impressed. I mean, yeah. Obviously, we don't know little details like the resolution it was being rendered in. We don't know the frame rate exactly and all of this other information. And let's face it, tomorrow's games are not going to look like this. You're not going to suddenly plonk in your, GTX 2080 or 2080 Ti or whatever. And the games are not going to look like that tomorrow. But it is a tantalizing glimpse of what we might see in a generation or two on cards. And that's really what ray tracing is about. Nvidia and the other companies involved, like AMD, like Epic, like Microsoft, are not looking to replace standard rasterization techniques. I have gone over this in depth actually in a different video, which you can find linked in this video. Is basically how ray tracing works, so you can check that out if you so desire. But the long and short of it is that rasterization and ray tracing are going to work hand in hand, and ray tracing will do things that rasterization just can't really do well, such as reflections and handling, just lighting and shadows in a much more realistic way. And once again, with the inclusion of the RT cores, at least in theory, performance should not suffer quite as bad. We also have leaked benchmarks from graphics cards now. Some people speculate that this is the Geforce RTX 2080, or whatever it ends up being called, but 2080 is looking very, very, very likely given the hints that Nvidia themselves have pushed out. Or it could be a Quadro-based card. However, there are multiple leaks, multiple benchmarks for Ashes of the Singularity, and it's running at the crazy preset at various resolutions like 4K. Now, in my personal opinion, because the naming conventions of the GPU is basically just a standard Nvidia name, so it could be we're looking at different Nvidia GPUs. But the most important thing, at least my personal important takeaway here, is that the performance for this card is, well, A, really good, which is kind of good, important, and B, you're looking at roughly the performance of, let's say, a Titan V. Now, I say roughly because some of it's slightly lower, some of it's slightly higher. You're looking at 70 to 80 FPS, and that's roughly the level of performance that a Titan V would be able to output. I say roughly because, well, 70 is a little lower, 80 is a little higher. So my personal takeaway here is most likely looking at multiple different SKUs, or possibly just because they're running different driver versions. After all, it's very unlikely that they have final drivers yet. The cards are not touted to be released until the 4th quarter. That means, at least in theory, they still have room for optimization. They still have room left to tweak and to get more performance out of the tank. Now this is a slight aside, but it also makes me curious to hear what AMD are going to be doing. Now obviously we all know that right now AMD have Vega. They are releasing Vega 7 NM, which is mostly going to be for AI and compute type of scenarios. We're not really looking at the the WXs, the Radeon Pros. We're not really looking at those necessarily for CAD. They can certainly do that, but it's not really what they're doing. For gaming, obviously, they've got Polaris lineup with the 500 series, which is of course a refresh of the 400 series, and we all know the state of play. We do know that they've got both Navi and they've got Next Gen. We don't know really anything about Navi other than Sony supposedly are asking for it to be on the PlayStation 5, but that actually brings up several questions, and hopefully we can get an answer pretty soon. What would be really amazing is if we got a leak to tell us whether ray tracing was going to be part of the PlayStation 5, because if we heard a developer or someone say, yes, the PlayStation 5 handles hardware ray tracing, we can almost immediately know that yes, ray tracing and Navi are one and the same, that ray tracing has some type of hardware acceleration on Navi. Or if we hear Microsoft have it, that's going to raise some questions as well. That would mean there's a possibility that Microsoft are tapping Nvidia for ray tracing, for their GPU. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are. I have some questions as to whether AMD would not be providing the hardware to Microsoft. The first is that Microsoft obviously can go with a single APU design. It's not out of the realms of possibility that they couldn't go with Ryzen Nvidia GPU. I mean, technically it can. I mean, after all, you could put like a GTX 1080 in a Ryzen processor. It's not like suddenly the CPU explodes just because they're like, AMD and Nvidia in the same system. That doesn't happen. So technically it could work as like a SoC or, an APU. You get the idea. So that could be a potential possibility. Another possibility is that Microsoft are not actually using Navi. They could be using an entirely different GPU from AMD. But the bottom line is, of course, AMD did get the contract from Microsoft for the Xbox 360 and now, of course, the Xbox One and Project Scorpio, which, of course, turned into Xbox One X. And there was some bad blood there, which you can read in a different, time regarding Microsoft and Nvidia. But that was a long time ago. We're talking the original Xbox here. So it's possible it's just, water under the bridge now. And furthermore, you've got the fact that, well, they're working so close with one another in terms of ray tracing. It's kind of hard to know, but I'm curious. And the reason that I want to know this stuff is A, because what goes on consoles does ultimately also impact us as PC gamers, right? That's just well known. And two, it also makes me curious what AMD are going to be doing for their graphics. And I don't know, maybe it's going to take AMD a generation or two to catch up with RT, but perhaps it won't. So what are my final takeaways here? Personally speaking, I'm really excited with Turing. It answers a lot of questions. So it tells us that Turing is not a cut down version of Volta. One of the theories I had for a long time was that Turing was Volta but just changed. And I guess that technically is true. It's just that we're not looking at the changes that I initially anticipated. Although I did assume that there might be something different regarding the ray tracing side of things. I did wonder if I did mention a couple of times on video, I did wonder if there was going to be something specific for ray tracing acceleration. And it was obvious the way that Nvidia have been really pushing ray tracing, that they had figured something out, but whether it was some just tweaks to the tensor cores, whether it was something specific for ray tracing, whether it was going to run in software and maybe they had some hidden techniques, who knows? But now we do. And ultimately, the next generation of Geforce cards is going to be pretty amazing. But, and I'm not telling you what to do with your money because we don't have benchmarks yet, I want to point a couple of small things out. I know it's really easy to get on the hype train with the next generation of Geforce, but when you buy the next generation of Geforce cards, RTX, it is not suddenly going to mean that, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic is going to suddenly have ray tracing. It's not going to run Doom 2016 with ray tracing unless there's patches or something else that we just don't know about. That's not going to happen. Of course, what it does do is it gives you the extra performance. But if you've got a really good GPU right now, let's say a GTX 1080 Ti, it might be just worth waiting and just saying, you know, I'm glad the card's out, but maybe wait for the 2080 Ti. But then again, if you've got like something like a GTX 1070 and, you know, you've upgraded to a 4K screen, then without a question, I can see the logic of wanting to upgrade because these cards are going to be considerably faster. We're hearing so many different reports of how much faster they're going to be. We're hearing 50% faster, we're hearing 60, 70, 80% faster. Ultimately, I want to wait on the speculation until we do hear more. But it does look like, from these benchmarks anyway, that these cards are going to be really powerful. And if these, actually the Singularity benchmarks are indicative of the performance we're going to be looking at with the 2080s, it's possible that most games will be able to run at 4K 60 FPS without too much of an issue. And I stress the word most games because, well, we don't know what, let's say, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is really going to take to run at 4K 60 FPS, particularly with different quality options, and that's the other thing as well. By the time you factor in high anti-aliasing and all of that stuff, we don't really know what type of impact that's going to have on the cards. But I, for one, I'm really happy that we're learning about this stuff now. Kudos to Nvidia. It's a really cool architecture. I'm really happy we've got real-time ray tracing coming in games. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. It's probably not even going to be 2019 when we're seeing titles like Metro Exodus, excuse me. But by around 2020, especially if the next generation of consoles has support for this, we're going to be good. With all of that said, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. If you have, do subscribe and share it around. Once again, this is an article which you can find linked in the video description, which more summarizes my thoughts in this particular article. You can also check out the ray tracing explained video as well if you want more in-depth information on that. But I'm going to let you all go. So take care of yourselves. Bye for now.